Welcome back. We're unpacking C18 and how that will impact the Canadian media industry, how it will impact big tech, and what's the government role in all of that. And joining me again is Peter Menzies, who's a former vice chair of the CRTC and also a senior fellow with the MacDonald-Laurier Institute. Thanks again for joining me, Peter. So in your recent journal piece for the C2C Journal, there was a phrase used. I don't know if this was your editors or if it was yourself, because I caught it in the beginning. But it said the C18 is perhaps nothing more than palliative care for zombies. What a grabbing phrase. What did you mean by that?
Well, I kind of stole that phrase from Jen Gerson, who used it initially to refer to zombie newspapers, zombie publications, and she was, I think, specifically referring to a lot of the post media products. These there used to be these great titles: Vancouver Sun, Edmonton Journal, Calgary Herald, all those titles, and they're just kind of walking around like zombies, like they sort of appear to be alive, but they're not really alive, and in terms of their content. So, but that's kind of what it's got to. It's almost like, instead of having, if government's going to take action, it should take action on developing a proper news industry policy nationwide that helps people build and transition to the next phase. But what C18 is doing is trying to subsidize people in situ, in the space they're in right now, which is not a good space. It's a zombie space. They're neither living nor dead. They're sort of between worlds, but you're subsidizing them to stay there and not providing incentives for them to move back to become alive again.
Well, there was an incentive program, though, developed several years ago where I think there was an incentivization to get the print journals kind of up with the times and do more online. Was that not enough of an incentive?
Apparently not. No. I mean, what you really need is a market-driven incentive of some kind. And, like I always used the old saying goes, a hanging tends to focus the mind, right? So when your survival becomes dependent on it, you innovate, or you try, at least you try to fight your way through. I mean, it's been clear to most observers for years that print is dead, right? So that's where the zombie things. I mean, print is really just. I mean, a lot of these papers they only actually print 15 or 20,000 copies a day, where they used to print 150,000 or 180,000. So it's all digital. They just have to think about a digital world where there's really no difference in terms of news between television, radio, and newspapers, because radio stations have launched websites, which in a lot of small towns are actually now they're actually killing off the weekly newspaper. But people are still getting news, just through a different form. And
You
that's
know,
what we need to be doing.
yeah, no, and you bring up a good point. When you say print media, and I'm sad to say that because I actually really do enjoy a paper copy of a newspaper. But when I read either a local paper or a national paper, I find sometimes the news is a little stale. It's not as up to date as now we've been conditioned to see when we go onto the online website. Because obviously there's a lag time between writing an article, getting it to the editor, and then getting it to layout and press. Uh, is is it the internet that has really killed off the print news?
Well, I think so. I mean, that's always been the risk for newspapers in terms of the print news. At the same time, you probably have a little bit more comfort that what you're reading in that print edition has been vetted and is solid. That in terms of the news, and not just the latest thing you saw on Twitter. But yeah, keeping up with the times is not good. One of the things I think that online doesn't offer is, and this is, I think, an issue that should be dealt with at some point. You don't learn anything by surprise. When you turn the pages of a newspaper, and I will buy a weekend edition still, and I think you'll see print surviving as a weekend edition.
Hmm.
Or I used to, when I get on an airplane, in terms of that, all of a sudden I'll turn the page and go, oh, there was a presidential election in Honduras. I didn't know that. It's not something that my algorithms are going to feed me,
That's a good
because I
point.
don't look up Central American things, but it's something I'm better informed after reading, and a little bit more knowledgeable about the world, because I learn it by accident.
And that's interesting because when we talk about, for me, I'm a free market kind of gal. I'd like the market to dictate what I like to see. But, how do algorithms don't factor into free markets necessarily? How you would never, like you said, you would never have searched for that Honduras story, but all of a sudden you learned something new. How do we measure that?
Well, the algorithms make you a prisoner of your own preconceptions. right? That's the interesting. You're building your own walls,
Yes,
and that's the tricky part. How do people penetrate that walls, and how do we avoid becoming people who just live in our own little silos? How do conservatives just because we're all more comfortable when we're hanging out with people who think like us because it makes us feel smarter, right, and more socially acceptable. So
that's right.
liberals hang out with liberals, conservatives hang out with conservatives, and then they start feeding each other.